Welcome to the Cannaman podcast, hosted by Global Cannabinoid Solutions, the world's leading cannabis science firm and cannabis market entry specialists. We look forward to hearing your thoughts on this latest episode of Cannaman.
We've got Darryl Bickler on today, who I've been wanting to get on the podcast for quite a while now. And the reason for this is I wanted Darryl to break down some of the legal paradigms of cannabis for us, but not just cannabis, but drug policy as a whole, and really put cannabis in context as a substance of use, but also as just a natural piece of the environment. So I wanted to welcome Darryl Bickler to the podcast, and just let Darryl take it away. So that'll feed in nicely. It'd be lovely to.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Chris, for asking me. It's a real privilege to have an opportunity to speak with you. I know we've spoken before, and I always love these opportunities to explain what I've learned over many years. I am actually a qualified UK solicitor, though I'm not in practice, so I can't actually give legal advice at the moment. But in my time in practice, I dealt with a lot of drugs cases, and I became quite frustrated with the way the courts were dealing with it. There's only so much you can do generally in courts. Most of the kind of approaches that people have taken to try and beat the system, as it were, whether they've been arguing for medical necessity for their cannabis use, for example, or they've been arguing for some kind of religious exemption. Most of these have failed. In fact, all of them have failed previously. And therefore, when you turn up in a magistrate's court, as you invariably do with somebody, there's no way that you can start raising these kind of issues, because they're always bound by precedent of the authority of the higher courts. The High Court or the Supreme Court has already judged on these matters. So what people often imagine a defense is are best mitigation, and I found that quite frustrating, because I don't really see it as mitigation. If somebody's got a peaceful and reasonable use of their private time using a drug for medical reasons or spiritual reasons, relaxation reasons, I don't feel that was properly a concern of public law and criminal law. And therefore, I became a bit frustrated with the mitigation process, because it invariably means that you're pleading guilty effectively, but with certain kind of little excuses which don't actually make you not guilty. They just might give you a lesser sentence, which clients are often happy with. But for me, I feel like when I do that, I'm kind of oiling the wheels of the oppression, that I'm there by necessity, they have to have a defense lawyer, and my hands are tied. And certainly when you're instructing barristers to take the matter further, if it's a Crown Court matter, more serious matter, or a matter on appeal, barristers won't push the envelope further, because they know that they're going to end up with a complaint about them, an adverse cost order perhaps, for pursuing matters which are already being determined by more senior judges. So it was quite frustrating for me. And one night, in the middle of the night, I had a call from someone with a very interesting American accent, who was I'd heard of, and I thought it must be a spoof call, somebody winding me up, but this guy was locked up on a 20-year sentence in Britain. He's an American citizen, and his name was Casey William Hardison, and he was notorious in the sort of psychedelic movement for manufacturing compounds like LSD, DMT, even MDMA, and other compounds. He was known as the Wizard, and he contacted me because I'd had some success on a sort of higher level with a case where I had previously been complaining to the Home Office that actually their advice that they were giving was very uncertain, and that people who were importing at that time dried plant material, which would contain controlled drugs within that plant material, but otherwise these plants were not controlled, were being prosecuted so that 5 kilograms of cactus bark or cactus flesh would be deemed to be 5 kilograms of Class A drugs, because it contains mescaline, or certain cacti do. And I'd written to the Home Office complaining about the illegitimacy of this law and these regulations, and I had a letter back agreeing with me, and that this letter had been used in a case which was the Crown versus Sette, SETTE, and my letter was produced in the final judgment as a reason why the defendant actually was acquitted. So it was quite a useful Crown Court decision that actually plants in that form, unless they're specifically detailed in the Misuse of Drugs Act, like cannabis and opium poppy are, but certainly a lot of other plants that contain psychoactives are not, then they wouldn't be able to get away with just saying that it was a preparation of drugs because they were dried or whatever process had been done to them. And Casey had read that, and that's why he called me. And whilst it had always been, in my experience, that the solicitor in running a case had to kind of lead the case, and I won't say put the client in their place, but you certainly have to kind of lower their expectations, because they'd be full of all kinds of wild ideas. And normally they would have very little knowledge of law. But in this particular case, Casey was a completely unique type of client in that he had researched forensically before calling me about the law, and he knew more about the law than I did. I mean, I sort of knew the basics, but would always defer to counsel. That was the solicitor's job: prepare the file, think about it, but then you get counsel to really dig deep into the latest possible arguments and research and precedents that you would need. That was the way it works. And it was almost like the client was senior counsel advising me. And it was quite a journey for me to let go of my ego and stop kind of complaining to him. Well, look, you've made these, what I used to call illegal drugs. And he's kind of stopped me there. He said, well, what I did was I made drugs without a license. And I think you'll find in your textbooks that illegal drugs are not mentioned anywhere. And he got me thinking about this, and I still struggled with the idea that here was an LSD chemist telling me what was what. And he sent me to the World Psychedelic Forum in Basel in Switzerland to meet people who really knew him and to attend some lectures about the possible benefits of psychedelics and in-depth discussions. And then he also sent me on a course about language in London because he felt that I was, despite being a lawyer, not really using language as precisely as he was. He was a scientist, a chemist, and he invented his own ways of making psychoactive molecules to avoid using the precursor elements, which are also often controlled or at least highly monitored, so that he invented a way of making LSD without those standard precursors by using special vacuum technology and other things. He had his own method. So he was really at the top of his game chemistry wise, but had fallen foul of the law because he became known as the Wizard. He set up the biggest psychedelic lab in Britain, and he got 20 years for the privilege of that. And I obviously felt sorry for him, but I didn't think there was much I could do. Ultimately, I couldn't save him. But what I learned in passing was very useful. And what I tried to do and did do was to take less serious cases, and I use the word serious in the sort of ordinary sense of the word and the way the courts would see it. So I would think, what are the most kind of user-friendly kind of clients I can get that I can also apply cases reasoning to, because he'd forensically examined the law, and together we did a lot of work, but he was definitely leading me on this. And I thought, well, people who use cannabis for their medical needs, whilst I was aware that medical necessity was something which had already been thrown out by the High Court for various reasons, but we also realized that the reasoning in the judgment wasn't exactly sound. But the new kind of ideas, the new arguments that Casey brought into the mix, I applied them because they're kind of universal ideas about how the law is administered and whether it's proportional and whether the government are doing their job in the way that they administer the Misuse of Drugs Act, were equally applicable to even people using cannabis. So I had a few clients who had volunteered to be sort of guinea pigs for this argument to be used in courts. And it was quite a checkered experience, a prolonged experience. It ended up with me being granted rights of audience, even as a solicitor, to appear in the High Court, because I wasn't charging for it. So I wasn't actually appearing as a solicitor, but what they call a Mackenzie friend. And a Mackenzie friend is somebody who helps, usually without pay, although it's not essential, but generally they're unqualified people who help people who don't have lawyers. And I managed, by adopting this status, to get rights of audience in front of the High Court. And in the High Court, you can challenge the lower courts. You could say there's an abusive process, or there's something beyond the normal running of the law, which is amiss. So that if you wish to complain, for example, that the government are abusing your human rights through some improper use of the law, then it is open to a sort of judicial review process. It is a judicial review, but it has a particular format when used in the criminal jurisdiction. And we were using this to kind of leapfrog from the Magistrates' Court to the High Court, where I had my audience in front of even judges like Lord Justice Leveson, quite a famous judge. And whilst it will obviously be disappointing to the viewers today to learn that we weren't successful in that, we know why we weren't successful. There was not exactly a fair hearing when we did these. I did several. I also represented a science teacher who was who'd been commended by Ofsted. He was a wonderful secondary school science teacher who had lost his career and been prosecuted as well, just for having, I think it was 2 or 4 cannabis plants, can't remember now, in a wardrobe that he used, obviously not at school, but during his lesson planning. And it helped him get into the mindset of younger people and find novel ways to explain quite complex principles in science. And he had the biggest Facebook support page that any teacher had ever had. You know, he was the best teacher in the region. And I helped him, and not only through the teaching council disciplinaries, and who were also fairly unsympathetic, but also through this judicial review process in the High Court. And during that time, I, by accident, was given the judge's papers, and I realized that there'd been some jigglery-pokery in the background, because one problem with judicial review in this country is that when people try to judicially review the government and what they're doing, is that these arguments that people submit are not usually read in their entirety by the judges at the first instance. It's too demanding. And they have civil servants in the High Court who are government employees who prepare the cases for the judges, like a summary. And when I read these summaries that had been accidentally given to me, I realized that we'd been stitched up, and there was literally a conspiracy to throw us off the tracks. Now, I was also, when I mentioned this at this science teacher's High Court hearing, that subsequent hearing, that I had realized what had gone wrong, they actually threatened me, and the court said that even though I wasn't being paid, well, they didn't say that, but notwithstanding the fact that I wasn't being paid, that they were going to charge me personally the full costs of the court and the prosecution for all the cases that I'd argued for. And they said, if I ever came before the court again, arguing for the human rights of cannabis users or drug users in general, or claiming that there'd been some misadministration in the law, that they would make me financially liable for the whole lot. So I had to rethink at that point. And despite the court saying that, I am nevertheless 100% certain that the arguments that I was using are valid, and they just don't want to hear them. And I think we'll tease out some of these principles later, because they're very interesting, and they were entirely novel for me when I first heard Casey talk me through his approach. And obviously I did work with him, and I learned a lot. So I really want to share some of those insights, notwithstanding that they haven't had a great deal of legal traction yet. Obviously, we wouldn't really be having this conversation if I had the answer that had already worked, and we wouldn't be talking about drug policy reform, we'd already be there. And of course, legal challenges are just one approach. People use general campaigning. A lot of the big reform groups, they will just campaign on purely logical principles. Some people might be trying various direct action approaches, like opening cannabis clubs without authority. And these are all things that can work together. When we're trying to achieve a political transformation of the landscape around us, we have to try everything. And because I'm really a former lawyer in this approach, and it all really boils down to how we treat people. What are our human rights? What are our civil liberties as adults in Great Britain today? And I would say that whilst having a conversation about what is a fairly niche subject, about the right to do what you like with your own body, with drugs, just to use a very vague term, drugs, I think we have to unpick that as well. But it's very apposite nowadays, because we've seen since the Coronavirus Act, and here we have a first time in history, a whole act of parliament with hundreds of paragraphs and details all about a virus and how we have to behave in response to that. And we've lost a lot of liberty. And so in some ways, talking about cannabis particularly is a little bit like complaining of your athlete's foot when you've got gangrene of the legs, because we really need to draw it out a little bit. I'm very happy to talk about people's interest in challenging the so-called cannabis laws. But what I'm trying to do with you today, Chris, is to draw it out and to show how medical freedom, as in having a right not to be coerced into, say, having a so-called vaccination or some medical treatment that perhaps isn't in your interest, particularly if it's, say, still in trial phase, or you've got some kind of worries or concerns about those. These are all part of the same picture about why does society disrespect us so much that it's so paternalistic that, like a very strict parent would forbid its children to, I don't know, watch certain movies or have a drink at at meal times or something like that. Excuse me. So I want people to really understand that their liberty is very much a holistic concept at the moment. And whilst we can look at it through any lens that we like, what we're really trying to do is to rescue our agency as free-thinking, autonomous, responsible adults. And I would go as far as to say that we should be free to do things or not do things, as long as we don't cross what is known as the John Stuart Mill harm to others principle. If we don't cross the threshold of causing antisocial behavior, then we should be free to do or not do those things. And I think that standard has been lost. And people complain about the Misuse of Drugs Act, and I understand why they do. They complain about the international conventions on drugs and narcotics that seem to be guiding all of these policies that are closing the doors to people's personal autonomy. And what I hope to sort of flesh out today is the best way to deal with that, because the Misuse of Drugs Act is extraordinarily misunderstood, even by the people who are there to challenge drug policy. Almost every drug policy outfit is saying we need to have a new act. And I'm quite wary about new laws, because the way things are going, they always end up being even more invasive and more controlling than the past, even if they give with one hand and grant people who want to use cannabis medicinally, they will take away as well. They will have so many new regulations and caveats and giving control to doctors rather than people. So what I'm saying is that the power should be with the people. It shouldn't be with corporations. It shouldn't be with big pharmaceutical companies. And it shouldn't even be with doctors who've traditionally balked at the idea of using controlled drugs until quite recently. There's now a move to medicalize access to many molecules. So it's not just about cannabis that people would be most familiar with, but there are other molecules and that have medical uses. In fact, almost any drug can have a medical use. And even labeling it as medical use or spiritual use or recreational use is kind of problematic. You know, if you take any kind of substance into your body, that's a very intimate physiological transformation of your way of being, and it changes your modality of thinking. And I don't really like to label it. I don't want to think that I'm could smoke this joint and it would start off medicinally, and then by the time I get to the end of it, I might be smoking it recreationally. I think these labels are problematic, and they're not necessary. We don't really need to justify ourselves. You see, it's for the state to justify taking our freedom away. They have to have good reasons for exercising controls. Controls should be proportionate. So laws kind of work it as an equation, and that equation is that they balance the reasonable activities of citizens, if we could still call ourselves citizens, with this idea of not causing social harms on the other side. So they kind of give with one hand and take on the other. And there is this kind of ideal balance that really explains how our common law works. And statutes like the Misuse of Drugs Act are actually designed to be compliant with human rights and our common law principles, believe it or not. Because the reason why I say the Misuse of Drugs Act is misunderstood is that I could give you a few bullet points to tell you why it's actually a very good act of Parliament that has been misused since its inception. And part of the problem is also the way that the international treaties and conventions have controlled the executive, that really means the working arm of government, in how they administer the law. And the first point I would make, because it's not often appreciated, is that the international treaties and conventions on narcotics are not part of UK law. They're not incorporated into our law, like, for example, the Misuse of Drugs Act is, or indeed the Human Rights Act is. These these international treaties are what they're called ratified instruments, and those bind the government whilst they choose to be so bound. Okay, there may be some consequences for the government just to suddenly step outside of these, but if you actually consider our rights from the Human Rights Act and our common law principles about how the Misuse of Drugs Act should operate, those should trump the international conventions. And indeed in America, in the United States, I should say, the very people who have, just move it out this glare if I can, the very people who have forced these covenants on the world, they are broadening the cannabis market, even though they've said they're not supposed to do that. And really, those international conventions are so historic. They pre-exist synthetic drugs. They pre-exist the internet and the dark web. They are totally outdated instruments of international control, globalist control. And yet they do not bind us. If there's the political will and if there's the force of public demand, then we can get round those. Now, the Misuse of Drugs Act is what we've got, and that is an act of Parliament, and Parliament is sovereign or is supreme in Britain. And the Misuse of Drugs Act, firstly, let's look at the title. It is the Misuse, not the Use of Drugs Act. So they clearly intend to differentiate between uses which are properly deemed to be a misuse and uses which are not. And for the uses which are not a misuse, the Home Office is meant to bring forward regulations for the supply and production of drugs that can be done either by exemptions or under license or by lawful authority to actually make provision for people to access those drugs. But of course, that's not happening at the moment, except for very narrow scientific purposes. But let's go back to the title. So it is the Misuse of Drugs Act. It's not the Use of Some Drugs Act. And here we get to the real kind of political hot potato in drug policy is why are the things that we can buy over the counter in pharmacies, the alcohol that we can buy almost everywhere that's got a license, or quite harmful tobacco products that have been available, not so readily available now as they were, but because they were really encouraged in the past. But why are these not drugs? So it's interesting when I attended like a drug policy debate, and I went to one last night, and they talk about drugs as if we all know what we mean. Oh, you know, when we talk about drugs, we mean heroin and cocaine and cannabis. We don't mean these other things. But then they're kind of gifting a little bit of a propaganda coup to the prohibitionists when they do that, because it's inferred in our language that drugs don't include alcohol, tobacco, and over-the-counter pharmaceuticals. And yet, scientifically, clearly, they are drugs. So we really have to kind of start thinking about the language that we use when we talk about drug policy, in that when we use the word drug, it really has to be inclusive. So why are those drugs not attached to the Misuse of Drugs Act at the moment? Well, it doesn't say in the Misuse of Drugs Act that people who sell a litre of vodka to a 14-year-old from an off license, or people that supply bundles of tobacco that they've illegally imported to avoid duty, are outside of the Misuse of Drugs Act. It doesn't say that anywhere. The Misuse of Drugs Act is entirely neutral. And of course, it's not really drugs that's been excluded from its operation. And this is because of administration of this act is not being done neutrally. But it's people concerned with those drugs. So people can get away with, breaking minor laws, relatively minor laws, get small fine or a slap on the wrist for breaking, say, an alcohol control regulation, whereas somebody supplying cannabis to somebody with MS or for medical use, notwithstanding my earlier comments that I'm just trying to make it look as sort of as extreme as possible, I guess, by calling it a medical use, but a peaceful use, shall we say, of cannabis, they will definitely be going before the courts if the CPS choose to prosecute. So, and they will be dealt with much more harshly than somebody who's dealing with drugs that are not currently under the Misuse of Drugs Act. But of course, all these drugs, the alcohol, tobacco, etc., they are within the purview, shall we say, or the jurisdiction of the Misuse of Drugs Act, because the Misuse of Drugs Act sets out to, well, in tandem with the Advisory Council, there's the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs Act, always called the ACMD, and they are an expert committee who are supposed to keep government up to date about drugs, which are or appear likely to cause harms to society. And yet the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs has never had any meetings about alcohol and tobacco, except with reference to kind of polydrug concerns, so that how alcohol might interact with tranquilizers, for example. But they've never set out to talk about the two drugs, which just so happen to cause more harm to society through misuse than all of the currently controlled drugs do put together. And so there's some kind of political misunderstanding there. And I don't want to keep, I could just keep going if you like, but really this is all down to the way that we understand the problem in language. Language is the key. Now, not only is language very important in terms of campaigning and propaganda, it always has been. I do recall there's a propagandist, a famous propagandist called Edward Bernays. He was charged at one point with trying to encourage women to take up smoking, particularly in the streets, because at that time it was a real social taboo for a woman to smoke, particularly in public. It would be like taking a piss in the street now. It would horrify people. And he managed to come up with a propaganda idea, and he called cigarettes for women were torches of freedom. Show your equality, light your cigarette on the street and show it, let men see you. This is how you express your freedom. And whilst obviously the sexism inherent in the society at that point was not what we would consider today in any way acceptable, it's amazing how they could use propaganda to incite people to take up an unhealthy habit for their equality. Now, if you believe that words have power, and I really do believe they have power, I think they create everything that's coming into existence. Without language, we don't really have any way of knowing what's what. We can't even describe anything. It's almost like nothing would exist without language. But when we get to law, it's even more important. It's almost like these words are like on steroids. They have even more power. And that's because laws are not really described by words, but they are words. Words are the very bricks and mortar of what might be quite an oppressive reality. So these laws define you in your possibility. What you can do culturally without being arrested exists where law isn't, in a way. And so the fact that laws are drafted, precise language, is something that we need to engage with very, very accurately, because this is where, dare I say, we're all going wrong. We're all going wrong because we are playing fast and loose with laws and the way we describe reality. And perhaps the biggest example of that is the idea that we would put out, let's say, I'll just give you one example, there are hundreds, but legalize cannabis. I don't need to say any more than legalize cannabis to talk nonsense to you. And I don't mean that in some kind of sort of phobic way that, oh, no, I'm, I think cannabis is dangerous or something, and I don't want people to have access to it. I don't mean that at all. I mean, if you want to improve your rights vis-a-vis drugs, or in particular cannabis in this particular instance, don't say legalize cannabis, because it is legally meaningless. You see, cannabis has no legality. It's a plant. And it's not just because it's a natural plant. That's a slightly different argument. I'm not saying, oh, you can't touch nature, man. It's like, it's sacred. I'm not saying that, even if I believe it. What I'm saying is that things, objects, which I'm going to include plants. I know some people would believe that plants are sentient and, they're not the same as completely inanimate objects. But for these purposes, relative to human agency and what we're talking about, they are objects. Now, objects can never be illegal. So people might think that guns are illegal, for example, but of course they're not, because if guns were illegal, how could the police have guns? How could the army have guns? How could private security agents carry guns? Well, they can, because guns can never be illegal. The only thing that can be illegal is an unauthorized possession or use of a firearm. So, you could have a license that would give you, would be a firearm certificate or a shotgun license, and you can have one, subject to various rules and conditions. So how does an object in your hands that you've got a license for, and then you give it to me who hasn't, how does that change from being a legal gun to an illegal gun? Well, it doesn't. The gun has no legality. The legality only can apply to something that you do or fail to do by omission. So if you've got a certain duty to do something and you don't do it, that could be a criminal offense. And if you do something that you're not allowed to do, that could be a criminal offense. So legality doesn't apply to plants, doesn't apply to drugs. It applies to it applies to actions. So why is this important? Because it does sound purely semantics. I know people just think, well, what's the difference? What's he talking about? Well, I'm saying not only are guns not illegal, but drugs can't be illegal, and therefore they can't be legalized. And these concepts are very unhelpful because, first of all, they communicate an absolute narrative that if something is either legal or illegal, then there's no kind of shades of gray in that anymore. And yet shades of gray is what we're really all about. I'm talking about the nuances and not coming out with highly irresponsible nonsense. So when certain groups like Transform Drug Policy Foundation say, yeah, we want to legalize all drugs, people go, yeah, great. And I'm thinking, well, hang on a second. Do you actually mean that it's okay for me to give crack cocaine to these kids? And they go, no, of course not. We don't mean that. We don't mean that. Of course not. Well, so well, why are you using language which seems to be absolutist? There's no shades of gray. And yet you actually do mean to have a whole raft of measures. That's what your whole blueprint for regulation is. You've got all these measures which are actually a little bit, perhaps a bit over the top, a little bit kind of obsessive about minutiae, where I think they've gone a bit too far. But nevertheless, they don't mean to legalize all drugs because that literally communicates a free-for-all. So why should we use that kind of language? The other thing is, of course, it's very dehumanizing. It's a bit like, imagining that if you drop a bombs on a city full of people, that's a war on bricks, or on a geographical location. It's a war on concrete. No, it isn't. It really isn't. So why do we use these dehumanizing expressions? I call them transferred epithets. And I know that sounds a bit of a technical expression, but it's nothing to worry about. Nothing to worry about in terms of understanding what it is. It is something to worry about when you start misusing them in drug policy. But a transferred epithet is something which shortens a sentence to make it a little bit easier to talk about. So I might say, well, I hurt my ankle, I need a walking stick. And everybody knows what I mean. But I can't take it back to the shop and say, that walking stick that you sold me, I asked it to take the dog out and it just sits there in the corner. I bought this as a walking stick. And they go, are you stupid or something? It's a stick to help you with your walking. We just call it a walking stick. And of course, we all know what we mean because it's hardwired into our linguistic programming, the way we learn to speak. We do it all the time. We know a disabled toilet is a toilet for disabled people. We don't think of it as being broken and disabled itself. So we're hardwired to accept that. And yet there's a real problem when I tell you that the law is made of words. I really mean it. And as soon as you change these ideas, so let's look at drugs then. So cannabis. What does the law say? Well, firstly, in the Misuse of Drugs Act, there is no crime of using any drug except for opium, strangely enough. And that is a legacy from the original Shanghai and Hague Conventions on narcotics, started about 120 years ago, that they decided that opium use should be a crime. But believe it or not, there is no crime of use. I think I mentioned that earlier when I talked about the misuse of drugs. So what they've done is they've not made using cannabis a crime, presumably so that we can regulate cannabis property, or the transactions that we undertake, whether it be cultivation, production, supply, or possession, that all of those actions or states can be regulated so as to differentiate between a use of this any cannabis and what could possibly be determined to be a misuse of cannabis. So I know people might think, well, you can't really misuse cannabis, but perhaps the law should say a misuse of cannabis is where you surreptitiously dose somebody's birthday cake with canna butter without telling them, or that you provide it to kids, or that you supply cannabis that's sprayed with all kinds of toxic hormones. That might be a misuse of cannabis that the law might come down on. So it describes cannabis, moving on, it is a controlled drug, which means that it's illegal to possess it or to cultivate it or supply it without an authority, exemption, or a license. Now, the Misuse of Drugs Act, it has various sections within it. If people want to check them out later, you can look at section 7, 22, and 31. Now, these are the sections which make the Misuse of Drugs Act compliant, really, with human rights and the common law. They're what make it reasonable, because they allow the government to make regulations and to make provisions so that people can go about all kinds of peaceful activities or responsible activities with any drugs. And that's what the Misuse of Drugs Act can do. But the problem with the language is that because people say, well, possession of cannabis is illegal, therefore cannabis is illegal, this is the big mistake, because cannabis cannot be illegal for the reasons I said. It's only the non-authorized, unlicensed, or non-exempted possession of cannabis that is a criminal act. And it's those three things, those exemptions, authorizations, and authorities, which should be our target area, because nobody's saying everything should be a free-for-all, even with cannabis, and certainly more applicable to synthetic drugs and drugs which have a higher propensity for misuse or abuse, is that nobody's suggesting that there should be no regulations over their sale or distribution at all. And yet the language denies this possibility. They kind of close the door by talking about legalizing the drugs, because what we're really talking about are creating licenses, exemptions, and authorities. We can go through those in a minute. I'm just having a little sip of water, excuse me.
No, please.
And we can talk about those in a minute, because those are the things that we should be arguing for, because they don't cross the threshold. Now, the threshold, I remind you, is not actually your health or whether it's good for you or bad for you. You don't need to prove that you've got a benefit, and you don't need to disprove that it's going to harm you. That's not what it's about. The threshold is there, and it says this when we look at the Misuse of Drugs Act, what the responsibilities of the Advisory Council, the ACMD, are, and that is to prevent social harm. So the more we start talking about medical benefits and these kind of things, we're actually kind of opening new doors in doorways for more controls that are not borne out in the law we've got, which is why I say be careful about getting a new law, because they'll actually tighten it and they'll make it into some kind of mandatory health maximization law, because you could see recently how health and trying to protect people against a virus, probably a virus that was made in a lab, has been used to take away every single liberty. And Michael Fitzpatrick, a GP, wrote a book called The Tyranny of Health, and how a therapeutic state is actually quite a dystopian idea, because it means that the policing of our lives becomes ever more intrusive and sort of moves more and more towards the inner sanctum, the inner sphere of our lives. So criminal law is normally concerned with our public actions, what we do in the public arena, and how those impact upon others. You steal something from somebody else. You cause a disturbance and a fray that affects other people. But as soon as we put health into it, then we're almost moving towards some kind of communist regime where, you have to have morning exercise classes, eat 5 vegetables a day, practice safe sex, take 1 a month as a maximum. All this paternalism and regulation, we're inviting it in. So we've got to be a bit careful about how we follow these groups that are now saying 50 years of the Misuse of Drugs Act, what a disaster. What it is 50 years of misuse of the Misuse of Drugs Act, what a disaster. And the Misuse of Drugs Act is a brilliantly drafted tool that has been widely misused because of the misunderstandings that I'm trying to articulate to you today. And those are that we can split people into legal drug users and illegal drug users, and that the legal drug users are completely outside of the law, and the illegal drug users have no rights whatsoever because they're acting illegally before they even wake up in the morning, because there's a little rap in their drawer. And although they've not done anything, they've not streaked down the street, they've not beaten anybody, they've not robbed anybody to pay for their dealer. They haven't done anything yet, but they can still be raided, have the door smashed in with that big red key, and then treated like absolute rubbish throughout the whole criminal justice system, demonized because of this association with illegal drugs, which do not exist. They do not exist. You see, the problem, every time we talk about legalizing drugs, we're stepping into a linguistic paradigm which is entirely a construct created by prohibitionists to achieve this division in society, whereby people who use the drugs that they approve of are outside of the law, and that people who use other drugs are always, when I mean outside the law, I don't mean they're breaking the law. I mean that they're not even held to account by the law, and that the people using the other drugs that they list in the Misuse of Drugs Act now have no rights whatsoever. And actually, it is the responsibility of the Advisory Council to say, well, people misusing alcohol and tobacco and pharmaceuticals and over-the-counter drugs, they should be in the Misuse of Drugs Act, which doesn't mean to say we want prohibition of alcohol or anything silly, because the Misuse of Drugs Act is not truly an act of prohibition at all. It's an act of regulation. And I would say, don't talk about even regulating drugs. I wanted to transform the whole language paradigm, because while some kinds of expressions are not as offensive as others, it's an easy habit to slip into, is dehumanizing yourself. You're dehumanizing yourself. So we're talking about a war on drugs, very, very dehumanizing. And as I said before, misses the fact that we're not really talking about drugs, but some people. We've got decriminalizing drugs. Well, I've never seen any drugs that are criminals. I don't know what they mean, decriminalize drugs. Drugs have no responsibility before the law whatsoever. It's only, we're talking about decriminalizing certain activities with certain drugs, which is fair enough. But as soon as you kind of reverse the language, people say, yeah, we should tax drugs. Really? I mean, where are drugs going to get the money from to pay taxes? And whilst it does, it might just seem I'm kind of, banging on about this now. These figures of speech end up with an entirely false paradigm. It is literally a category error in the way that the administrators think about it. I mean, government talk about this. The government's got no intention of legalizing cannabis. Cannabis is an illegal drug because, and you'll hear that all the time. And look at the language; it's impenetrable, and they always come back. And that's because we're playing into their hands. We're playing into their hands by even thinking that cannabis can be legalized, because it has no legality. It can never have any legality. I think I should take a little breather, because I haven't let you start coming back.
I was just going to maybe track back and make sure that we digested a few things for people, Daryl, because that's exactly what I wanted. And for those watching, I think the best way to understand the ideas that Daryl's talking about is just to hear him speak, because it doesn't make sense if I just go through and interrogate you on each question, Daryl. And so for those who are just hearing this for the first time, that can be a lot of information to take in. And so I want to say thank you, first of all, but secondly, if we circle back over a couple of the themes that we've just touched upon, would you be able to just
I think it does need sort of explaining twice, but perhaps with a slightly different emphasis or a different angle sometimes.
Precisely.
Because people have questions, but they can't actually ask them. So it's almost like we have to anticipate what they're thinking.
No,
I mean, I would say just one little kind of like room summary, as it were, update is, well, look, you know, people say they want to legalize cannabis because cannabis is illegal. And I always say, look, cannabis isn't illegal. Using cannabis isn't illegal. And even the possession of cannabis isn't illegal unless you do not have an authority, license, or exemption. And I put it that way. I don't say that cannabis possession is illegal without those things. I say, no, cannabis possession is legal unless you don't have those things. It's like, so I'm reversing the emphasis, if you like, because that's exactly how the law should work. The law should be making these things. So just to look at those ideas just briefly, because as I said, they exist in the Misuse of Drugs Act. And an exemption is something which is very broad. So if, for example, and I'm not saying these things are written in stone, now I'm just giving examples. These are just matters of opinion. But if, for example, we believe that people over the 18 should be able to possess and grow cannabis, or indeed perhaps the same with other substances, because, well, I'll come back to that in a minute about the focus on individual drugs. You know, if we believe that, there's no need to have a license for you to have a joint at home. You know, why should you be applying to the Home Office at all? So what we're talking about, a broad exemption. So it's quite straightforward for the government, without even creating a new primary law, to grant a broad-based exemption to say, well, anything up to a certain weight of cannabis or a certain grow size of cannabis is exempt, as long as you're, you know, over 18, and perhaps, you know, you could lose your exemption right if you've been convicted of some reprehensible crime, whatever, spiking children's food and, you know, abusing them, God forbid, you know, that kind of thing. You perhaps wouldn't, you know, you would lose an exemption right. There would be people who could lose these freedoms if they abuse them. But that's going quite far down the path here. But really, what I'm saying is that exemptions are the broadest category. Now, authorities, those are the kind of things which apply to police and forensic laboratories who handle these drugs on a regular basis. So they don't need a license to do it normally. I mean, some of these things are done under license, but generally a police officer could take drugs off you. Like I said, the drugs are not illegal, because if it was actually illegal, then he wouldn't be able to actually have it himself. You could say, well, I'm making a citizen's arrest on you because now you're in possession of a legal drug. What I'm saying is that, of course, the drug has no legality. He's allowed to have it and you're not. Let's put it in blunt terms. You know, oh yeah, you're not allowed to have that, Sonny. I can take that because I'm a copper. Well, he's got the authorization. And then, of course, we have licenses. Now, licenses, people started talking about cannabis licenses. I think that's a bit extreme, really. I think that if you're into manufacturing psychedelics, or you're into manufacturing synthetic drugs, then perhaps a license is the appropriate format, because, like everything else in our society, you know, there's hyper-regulation, and people have got consumer standards, health and safety concerns about that. So we don't need to talk about licenses for small operations for cannabis or possession of cannabis, or even magic mushrooms, ecstasy, that kind of thing. But if you're into larger processes, then licenses appear to be quite a reasonable thing. If you want to be a commercial production of cannabis and produce everything to particular standards, exact concentrations of cannabinoids specified on the packaging, everything done scrupulously clean, then perhaps that licenses would be appropriate for those kind of things, but not for people who are homegrown, not necessary. But I think this is flowing on to this thing that I have to say now, because I've been mindful that your focus is on cannabis, even though I've kind of tried to to point out that we've got bigger fish to fry. And I would say, well, I don't wish to be rude about what I would call a fetish about a certain substance. I mean, because that is that's their interest, that's their right. That's perfectly reasonable. What I'm saying is, let's not take that fetish out into the law and start talking about legalization of cannabis, and that this is what I'm about. Because, okay, obviously, I would never talk about legalization of cannabis. I would talk about legalizing all peaceful people who could be concerned with cannabis. But at the same time, why are we dividing ourselves up into? I think it's a losing game. As soon as you start saying, I want something for a particular function, and I'm going to campaign for that. So I'm campaigning for cannabis for medicinal reasons. It's such a tiny window into what's really happening. It's not that it's going to be like a Trojan horse to explode the real oppression that's happening with the whole prohibition. And of course, the problems of prohibition are really worse for people who are, working as sex workers, people, people with HIV, people with, substance misuse issues, if you can call it substance misuse, but certainly people who are injecting drugs. There's so much, and it all has to be dealt with. And cannabis isn't the thin end of the wedge that suddenly opens the door to drug policy, because what we're really talking about is, how do we treat people? Do they need to come along and say, this is my prescription because I've got this problem and this drug will fix it? That doesn't empower people, because it's really something that's in the hands of doctors. You're not using citizenship rights. You're using a kind of patienthood victim status to gain some kind of entitlement by merit of your difficulties. And none of this should be necessary if we had a proper administration of the law in the first place. So in a way, if we sort of, by analogy, take the Misuse of Drugs Act as my analogy would be that artists are given black and white paint and they're not allowed to use any other colors. All paintings in the future will be done in black and white. There's your shades of gray. That's all you need. But actually, it's not very nice, is it? And then somebody comes along and says, right, well, how about if we campaign to get green paint and we could put green in it? And then, okay, it's a bit, my example is very direct in a way.
Great.
The green light comes into the painting and people, oh, great, I've now got green. But really, was that the problem? Was the problem that the police and the government decided that artists could only have black and white paint? Was it the absence of green paint that was really the problem? Or did I have to make some reason that actually, I want to paint grass and I want to paint landscapes. I do really, really, really need green paint. Please, can I have it? And went, well, seeing you asked, you can have a license to have green paint now. And you say, oh, great, a victory. At last, I've got a license for green paint. But really, what's going on there is that somebody who has absolutely no business in policing your art whatsoever, it is none of their goddamn business, has exercised this ridiculously arbitrary rule over your painting. And what you should be campaigning was is free access to all the colors of the rainbow palette and whatever on the Dulux scale. I want them all. And that's a very bold claim. Wouldn't you be better off starting off with green paint for landscape artists? Let's focus on the landscape painters. They need it most. And then, we'll see how we go. Once we've got green, we might go for pink. Well, it doesn't work that way, because what is actually happening is that the equation of your civil liberty, in balance with the rights of criminal law to stop you creating havoc for the people, is completely lost. It's completely lost, because they've just declared paint to be illegal. When they can't be. What they're actually saying is that artists are now restricted, they're now censored in their work. And drug policy is a censorship of your being. And you are permeable to thousands of molecules we call drugs. And you actually, as you will know, you've got a cannabinoid system and a cannabinoid system, which has natural receptors for and actually appreciates having cannabis in there. But every drug has to have a receptor for it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a drug. It wouldn't work. And our physiology is molecularly permeable through our skin or our lungs or our intestines, mucous membranes, to drugs. And yet what the law has come along, and it's a bit like it's put a massive condom over you and said, right, nothing's going to get through unless here's your alcohol hole. We can squirt that through, and here's your tobacco hole in there. But the rest of it will bounce off. And it's really that horrible kind of condom that they've put over us that is yeah, I know. I just
the analogies are on point today, Daryl, and you've got your colourful shirt on. You must, you're in.
Yeah, well, I have to wear it before they ban it. But
no, these are awesome analogies, though, Daryl. So if you want to add any more weight to those, please.
Well, yeah, I mean, outside of each of us, that we live in a sea of psychoactivity. Right, it's in the foods, even sugars. We know there's all these drugs that exist in nature, and of course humans are part of nature. Let's not get all sniffy about things being natural and MDMA isn't natural, or synthetic psilocybin isn't the same as mushrooms, or LSD isn't God's gift. Let's not get sniffy about that. Men have created it. We're all a product of our historical legacy of evolution and learning, and everything we do is built on the backs of other people. And so whilst I'm not saying that every synthetic drug is a good substance for everybody, or that it can just be used willy-nilly, what we actually want the law to do is to regulate a certain amount of activity where necessary, with a light touch, with a proportional touch, always cognizant of our autonomy and liberty to do with our bodies as we see fit, under that caveat that we don't create havoc, or we don't really just destroy everything around us by doing so. And so what the law tries to do in words, what it's supposed to do in words, I should say, is to make that membrane that I've sort of characterized as an impermeable condom, but to actually make it a semi-permeable membrane. If you know what those are, they're the kind of things that work with osmosis and allow certain molecules through, but keep out the poisons. So you can buy a water filter that's got a membrane in it, and it allows the pure water and a few useful salts and things to go through, but it won't allow big particles to actually stop at your skin. Is that you decide what's going into your body, what in terms of food and in terms of medication. Okay, you need guidance, you need expert guidance. Doctors are there to help, not anti-doctor. Although what's happening at the moment is that professional expertise in many areas, including law and medicine, is becoming less and less about your own real research and knowledge, but more and more about following check boxes that you're being given on high. So most doctors think they're an expert on these so-called vaccinations, but they're not really. They're just being told what to say by the pharmaceutical companies and the authorities, that this is what you should be promoting. And by the way, you'll get paid £25 for each child that you jab. So it's corrupted in a way, and we've got to be careful about playing into them, because ultimately we are in quite a dystopian reality here outside of the cannabis bubble, that weird things are happening around us. And it almost seems churlish to be talking about a cannabis club when they can literally say, well, you've got to be in bed by 10 o'clock. And if you're with more than 6 people, you could die. I mean, look what's happening in Australia. People have been, coshed and rubber bulleted in the street. People have even been shot with live ammunition for demonstrating not wearing a mask. And they are coercing people to force them to take these vaccines. And I don't care if everybody who's listening has had it and they're happy with it, that's fine. What I'm talking about is choice not to have it if you don't want to participate in what is a trial. And this is why we need to broaden out our thinking about, well, I'd like the right to have cannabis. You'd also should have sovereignty. This is what it's about, sovereignty over yourself, so that you can choose to have cannabis or whatever, or not have it. Nobody's going to come along. We carry on like this. People say, well, you've got to have it. they'll end up saying, we think cannabis might calm you down. You've got to have it. You'll be held down and given it. We're literally at this kind of level now where everything is either banned or compulsory. You either got to or you mustn't. And actually, what we really want is to rescue ourselves as citizens, as adults, recognize that we're not children, we won't be treated like children, and recognize that children are children, we won't treat them as adults. Let's get these kind of normal boundaries. I know these things are not drawn in sand because I used to represent young people in court, and it was always very awkward when you try to establish when somebody is really competent, because when government originally, when they decided that 10 and 12-year-olds know the difference between right and wrong, they really lost the plot, because that was almost like believing that they can consent like adults. And that is the mistake that the actual real predators and sex offenders make, is that they don't literally attack children. They groom them to get the children to consent. And of course, we know that consent isn't valid. And yet they think the consent is valid now, to consent to having something that's even more intimate, which is like, some kind of special messenger RNA injecting into you to make these spike proteins. Like I say, I'm not going to say it's definitely dangerous. It's not my area of expertise. I'm only interested in the choice. So when I talk about these issues, don't find yourself losing me because you believe in the vaccination program or whatever. It doesn't matter. I'm not against you for believing that. I'm not saying you're wrong. What I'm saying is that we must allow adults to choose, and also recognize that children can't really consent because they don't understand the world in the same mature way, with all the references to social norms and experiences that adults do. And as adults, we can make our own minds up about what happens to our bodies, in tandem with good neutral advice and the medical professions who work with us to help us, not to tell us what to do, but to help us. This is all about informed consent. And at the moment, it's been flushed down the toilet, the idea of informed consent, because the information that people have been given is completely skewed. It's companies like Pfizer have paid out the biggest payouts in legal medical history for misleading doctors for producing false data. And yet we're expected to rely upon them. And so with this situation, it actually ties into the whole drug policy debate, because it really shows how they have complete contempt for respecting what we choose to do as adults. They just say, you don't really matter. You're not even in your own equation of your own existence. And it's like you're being made into a puppet. And we should be nobody's puppets, because each of us is the unit of humanity. Everybody's a unit of humanity, as sacred as that is. And it's a divine thing, without going into any religious belief, that if you want to practice something that helps you achieve a state of meditation, a state of enlightenment, a state of pain relief, a state of bliss, a state of insight, a different modality of thinking, that all that could happen for some people with a simple use of cannabis. Other people will use different drugs because they've got even different ways of operating. Everybody knows, that until you've tried something, you never really know what it's about. And you try something, you go, wow, I didn't know it could be like this. And it's letting people know that it could be like this, but in a safe way. It could be different. Things can be different. You can see the world in a different way, in a much more caring way. You could see it in a more environmentally sensitive way, perhaps. You could see it in a more comforting way with the people around you. You can be more empathic. But none of these things are on the table for us, because we are just units of production who have been controlled and engineered, and they're mounting psychological operations against us. They're using fear, which they've always used in drug policy, but fear now about, that we are not humans, but vectors of disease. And they've created that. They've created a lot of false information, the same way that they put all this is your brain on drugs and smashing up eggs and things like that on propaganda videos over the years. They've done the same thing with crisis actors, and NHS is looking for people to play the role of seriously ill patients, advertising, even, they're manipulating us. We are being manipulated. And I'm saying that one way to resist this is to adopt a powerful language paradigm. And one of the things that we can look at is this drug policy, because it is a good example of putting yourself at the center of the equation, always looking at it from a human-centric point of view, not an object-focused point of view. So we don't decriminalize objects, and we don't have wars on objects, we don't legalize objects. Every time we talk about it, we're going to bring ourselves straight through that it is, you're talking about me, you're talking about policing my biochemistry. What is your agenda here? Why are you doing this? You know, I resist that.
I think, well, it's unfortunately not something that anyone really gets exposed to in adolescence or in life, and even through school, through adulthood. You very rarely get to understand what the implications of all of these laws and pieces of policy and acts really are. And it's not until someone's spoken with someone such as yourself, Daryl, who can break down the nuances. And you're really a scientist of law in a way, and being able to talk about the equation of words and the language that's used and how important those words are as an actual sort of fabric to society at the moment. It's quite, for someone that's not heard any of this before, I imagine, I remember the first time I spoke with you, Daryl, it was really quite mind-blowing, because I'd never considered this conversation in terms of words and in terms of what the actual law is talking about. I've always looked through the lens of, say, well, here's the facts, but not really understanding how that intertwines with law, and the law doesn't necessarily need to be based on any of those facts either. It as much as it's meant to be, there's a lot of perspectives and paradigms, and it depends what lens you're looking through the conversation at. And if everyone's focused on drugs, the products, cannabis, whatever it may be, we're not looking, and we're forgetting ourselves and that we're part of this conversation, our rights. And it seems as though that we're just sort of lacking consistency in law, and there's just so many holes in the narrative now. And it doesn't just stop with drugs either. It's not just drug policy. It seems to be a trend that's occurring right throughout a lot of our
disrespect for the individual. Yeah. I mean,
yeah. So I guess my question then, Daryl, to lead into that is, we've spoken a lot about cognitive liberty and autonomy of choice. What are some of the ways that people can maybe be more aware of their language and aware of their autonomy? Because we've had quite an abstract conversation, but in real terms, and some of the analogies you use were really quite marvelous in terms of color palettes, for example.
It's never going to come easy to reframe the way that we speak, because it's a habit. It really is a habit. And I know some people, they think, oh, that'd be quite a good idea. And then they kind of come unstuck, because we tend to talk in memes and sound bites. So a lot of things that are part of our conversations are not always free flowing, but we kind of appropriate little parcels of information that we've got stored away, like an anecdote. Do you remember the time we did this? That kind of story, which is, it's almost the antithesis of real conversation in a way, because although people are quite curious to hear content, they're not really free-flowing conversations where everything interacts with what the other person is saying, and they can be really creative. We tend to rely on facts and information. And obviously I'm doing it in this conversation, though in the last few minutes, it kind of came a bit more freestyle, which was nice. But a lot, because I've said it before, I go, oh, well, I'm going to do that bit now. And whilst I might change it, but because our work, for example, if we've been talking about drug policy for a long time, we've been talking about, well, I really feel that we should have a debate about the nuances between legalizing drugs and decriminalizing drugs, because that's what we've always done, because Release want to do decriminalizing drugs and Transform want to do legalizing drugs, and we need to understand these terms, and we're going to have this discussion. It's set in stone in a way, not literally stone, but it's kind of it's been wired by habit. So what the psychologists have realized with the coronavirus thing is that they make people do things a bit arbitrary, like, only have groups of 6, or when you stand up, put your mask on, sit down, take it off. As soon as you actually go through these actions, you become, it becomes habitual, and it changes the way you are. And this is where we're at, in a way, that we've been having habitual conversations about drug policy, thanks to fairly incoherent people running it. And so we've all heard about this kind of having a false opposition in Parliament. We got one guy on one side saying we're going to introduce these regulations, and then Keir Starmer said that's not nearly enough. And we've always got got used to that way of being, and we have to break the habit in a way. But I don't want people to give up, because imagine if I was sort of like lurking behind them, God forbid, and every time they were talking, I would say, oh no, don't say it like that, don't say it like that. It would drive them mad, and they would realize they were slipping out, and they'd probably then have an upset and say, well, I'm not doing that shit anymore. It's impossible. And it is very challenging to reframe your paradigm. But in deep meditation, you might actually suddenly, it would actually dawn on everyone at a certain point when they're reflecting upon it, that actually this is what's happening. You could be, on magic mushrooms, and you sort of, this is about me. This is about my relationship with everything around me. You start to suddenly see things differently, and it's almost like we do need some kind of transformation or an epiphany of a sort to happen. And I know it's not so easy to happen just listening to some bloke, with the light shining behind him, talking about it. But if we could try to put it into practice, even if it seems awkward, because it does, it's always awkward to break these molds. A bit like, whatever it is, it's always difficult to stop smoking cigarettes or give up, cream cakes or something.
It's habitual.
It does require, it isn't always an easy process. It's almost like, I remember this thing that I think it was just a joke, but the idea that when people swing a golf club, if they lift the head up, they always make a mess of it. And somebody invented this headband with a hook that went behind their testicles. And if the head comes up, they learn to keep their head down, because otherwise every time they put their head up. So it's almost like, a little electric shock treatment every time we start talking the nonsense that unfortunately all of our main drug policy reformers will lead us down. And it's not about being very, very clever or anything, because I found that the most, I won't say ordinary, because nobody's really ordinary, but just unpretentious people without a huge amount of education have got it in a flash. And yet I've sat there arguing with High Court judges for hours who actually can't even see what I'm talking about, because they've got their head so deep into that everything must make sense. So be prepared. I would say be prepared to accept that not everything is as it seems. And just because every country in the world says that, that there's something happening, like in concert, or it doesn't mean to say that it's happening. Just because the BBC says something every single day doesn't mean to say it's true. And just because, every single organization in the world is talking about decriminalizing psychedelics or something, doesn't mean to say that they actually are coherent. It's to find the right language for yourself based upon the facts that I'm giving you, because you talked about facts. And when we're talking about language and law and what needs to be done, these are facts in a way. We can have difference of opinion about what actually should be done, but the fact is whether or not we're using the right words to describe that. So when I say it's a fact that cannabis cannot be legalized, most people would take that as me being some kind of prohibitionist who's just absolutely determined. If you are taking a canna-centric kind of perspective, which is your right, I'm not here to say you should be.
Could we track back 2 minutes there, or a minute or?
Hi, did you?
Oh, sorry, we just dropped out a little bit.
Yeah, so I was just letting the dog out as well. It's barking. But what I was saying is that I don't have I don't have a problem people choosing to focus on cannabis, or even cannabis for particular medical purpose, even though I was kind of ridiculing its narrowness in a way at the same time. Because the key point is that by adopting the principles that I've described today in terms of legal understanding and language, that it will automatically become more useful and more powerful, notwithstanding that you don't really need to ask permission to do something as an entitlement. This is the weakness, is that entitlements are things which apply to certain people, and I'm always pushing for universal rights that apply to everybody. So an entitlement would be that I've got a prescription because I've got, arthritis, and therefore I get it. Now, if people want to argue for that, it is weaker than saying, they think it's the thin end of the wedge. It isn't the thin end of the wedge. And I'm not sure if people understand why yet. It's not, we have to grasp the nettle, which is, well, I think that any adult should be able to do this. And people don't want to do that. They think, oh, let's just find this. Like I did it. I did it for Casey. I tried to find, the easiest way in. But I soon realized that not only are we on the defensive, but it is actually being divisive, and it is not taking power to the human back to citizenship, but it's actually giving it to third parties, to judges, to doctors, to decide what's good for us, that I'm now justified. So if you decide to go down that route where you're not really a civil liberties campaigner, but you are, seeking entitlement for a needy group of people, and I'm not knocking them. I'm not knocking them in the slightest. I understand that they're very sincere, and that cannabis, for example, or it could be psychedelics in clinics, that these they see it as necessary. And I'm not arguing. In order to not, it will never be an incremental progress towards anything politically on its own, because rather than seizing power, seizing agency, and rescuing our humanity and our subjectivity as free-thinking adults, it's giving that to experts, so-called experts, in what's best for us, whether they be doctors or counselors or whatever. And we have to be careful to avoid that. So what I would say is that you don't have to give up your day job in that sense of petitioning for other people. I mean, remember, at all times, it really is about you. All these poor people dying in the streets, I stand for them. Well, nice, but really you stand for yourself, because, it's against all of us. This biomolecular censorship, this cultural censorship of thinking, it's applied to everybody except the elites. So what I'm saying is that if you choose to go for like a soft target, because you feel comfortable with that, if you remember all times to use the right legal paradigm, to always remember that you're asking for something that you actually are entitled to, it's not a favor, but we're entitled to things, and always use the language described in Misuse of Drugs Act, that use is not illegal, understanding that drugs are not illegal, to your particular entitlement-based approach, you will necessarily be helping and be more powerful, because you really then are opening doors rather than shining light through a crack saying, can I see this? Can I see that? No, you really are opening the door when you do that, because as soon as you confront the legislators with legal reality about what their duties are, even if you're doing it through the lens of cannabis, notwithstanding that you are just got green paint now, for landscape artists kind of situation, it's not to get excited about and say, well, this is a major victory. You do it through powerful legal argument that you would actually be helping, because you are rescuing subjectivity, not victimhood. It's not just that I'm in so much pain, please help me. It's that I'm a human being. I have a right to be treated neutrally by the Misuse of Drugs Act. proportionately, and you need to administer it in that way. I may be coming at you as a cannabis user, but I'm coming to you principally as a human being.
We hope you have enjoyed this episode of the Cannaman podcast. For more information on how you can safely navigate the cannabis ecosystem, take a look at some of our educational materials or reach out to us at www.globalcannabinoidsolutions.com. We look forward to you joining us on the next episode of the Cannaman podcast.